Hello everyone and welcome to this week's video. My name is KM Weiland and I run the writing website helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And today I want to talk about the three most important characters from a structural perspective within your story. So very often, two of the most common questions that writers will ask about characters in their story is how many characters do I need and or can I have? And which characters do I need? What characters are important and how can I tell which characters are actually important within and for my story? And you can actually look at this from a structural perspective. And what I'm going to be sharing here is definitely like the stripped down version. It's getting under the hood. It's looking, kind of like some of the mechanics of how story works. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's meant to show you the foundation upon which you can build your entire cast of characters. So when I say there's only three, don't freak out. It doesn't mean you can only have three characters in your story. Okay, so from a structural perspective, what actually creates plot, makes your story move, all of that, there are three specific types of character who are important to make that story engine run. And the first and most obvious is, of course, your protagonist. Now, when we hear the word protagonist, very often what we think of is the hero, the main character, the good guy, something along those veins. We think of a specific person, possibly like a specific type of person actually pops into our mind and we see, we have a visual idea of what a protagonist is. Maybe you see your protagonist from your story. So it's very specific, but actually sometimes this can be a little bit distracting from the deeper understanding of what protagonist is and how it functions within the story. So within story, within plot, what a protagonist does, all that defines them, is they are the person who is creating the forward momentum with the plot. And they do that by wanting something. They have a desire, which will translate into story goals, that is moving them forward. Now, it could in some stories be the desires that they just are wanting to move away from something else, but it could also be that they have something specifically in mind that they're moving toward. And you can think of this, as basically like the change that you're going to see within your story. So whether they know it or not, what they're moving toward is the end of your story. It's whatever state they're going to be in. It's wherever the plot finds them, at the end of the story. That is ultimately what they're moving toward. And the protagonist is the one who creates that through line and that momentum moving through the story. Without a protagonist, we really don't have a story. It's the person who is defining what this story is about. And, theoretically, you could pick any number of specific characters within your story to be that protagonist. It just would slightly change, the nature of your plot. So, different characters will want different things, and that would drive and create a different plot. But the protagonist is the through line. So you want to make sure that the protagonist lines up with all of your major structural beats throughout the story. Usually that means the character will be present, but more specifically what it means is that what's happening at those structural beats needs to be in alignment with the protagonist's forward momentum, with that movement toward the end state of the story. So if you have, if you can identify any particular structural beat within the story where that really isn't happening, where they're not moving toward that end state, then it's probably a good sign that that structural beat is off in some way. So the protagonist from that perspective is the single most important character for defining your story's structural through line. They create the through line, and the through line should be created for them, right? It's a vehicle for them. The second most important character, and really they're equally important because you need both of them. The second one is the antagonist. And similarly to the protagonist, we often hear that word and we think bad guy, right? We think a morally negative person, a villain. And that's not true. That's not what an antagonist is at all. That has nothing to do with being an antagonist. We only think that because generally speaking, the protagonist is someone who's morally positive and who we sympathize with from a moral point of view. And therefore the antagonist stands in opposition to that and is often characterized as someone who's morally negative or at least ambivalent in some way. However, within story form, just functionally speaking, all the antagonist is whatever or whoever is creating the obstacles between the protagonist and their forward momentum. The antagonist and I often like to use the term antagonistic force rather than antagonist, because this also reminds us that the antagonist doesn't have to be human. It doesn't have to be a specific character within the story. It usually will be, and it will usually at the very least be represented at certain points throughout the story by characters, which we'll talk about in just a second here. But fundamentally, all the antagonistic force is within a story is whatever is creating opposition that the protagonist has to move through. Because without the antagonistic force within a story, without this opposition, the protagonist can move unhindered. They move very easily and smoothly toward whatever the end state is within the story, and they reach it, and the story's over. The very fact that we have a story, we have a lengthy tale to tell, means that there's roadblocks, there's obstacles, there's difficulties, conflict that's encountered as the character moves through as the protagonist moves through the story. And the antagonist is that necessary counterforce within the story that creates that opposition for the protagonist to have to work through, and therefore creating, the conflict and the interest of the plot. The third character is a little more interesting in some ways and not as obvious. And the third character is the relationship character. And this character can actually take quite a few different forms within the story. So, you might immediately think of a love interest or something like that. It could be a sidekick. It could be any relationship within the story. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is, from perspective of story, is a motivating force for the protagonist within the story. And again, this can take many forms. It could be an impact character who is representing the story's thematic truth and prompting or inspiring change. A love interest very often will, act within a character arc as someone who kind of rewards or punishes based on the protagonist's effectiveness within the plot, based on their relationship to the lie and the truth, and how that allows them to either move forward or not against the antagonistic force. But it doesn't have to be a love interest. It's a relationship that is important to the character and is creating motivation for what they're doing. It doesn't necessarily mean that they want whatever the end goal is for this relationship character, but the relationship is shining a light on the why, right? The antagonistic force within a story is shining a light on all of the things that the protagonist hasn't dealt with or hasn't figured out yet as a way to be able to move forward toward the end goal. Whereas the relationship character is kind of this broader context of why they're doing it, what they're trying to build, why they're trying to expand. And again, this isn't necessarily something they're conscious of, but you'll see it in stories, as the characters move through it, where there needs to be kind of that relational level so that there's a catalyst, there's a why behind it. And again, just like with the antagonistic force, this doesn't necessarily have to be characterized. It's entirely possible, you have a story that's about one character, right? There's one character on stage. And in that case, these other two forces within the story will either be internalized and they'll be aspects of the protagonist character themselves, or they'll be reflected somehow in the world around them, in the setting, as we see in stories where, a great example just off the top of my head is the Tom Hanks movie Castaway, right? He's all alone on an island. The whole story basically is him lost on an island. He's stuck in the middle of nowhere and has to survive. We see, the antagonistic force is mostly just the weather and the elements and him trying to, figure out how to make the island work in a way that he can survive off of it and won't die. And then later on in the story, we also see, within himself, his own difficulties, as his own fear and just anger and frustration and all of that, is also working against him. And he has to work through that as a way to continue toward his end goal and state, getting off the island and surviving. And then, of course, we have the relationship aspect, the context created, in his relationship with the volleyball Wilson, who he personifies. But of course, is really just him, right? It's giving him something to care about, something where he can project, meaning and purpose out onto something else into the world. So he doesn't feel so alone. Right. So that's a great example of how all these three of these elements work within a story without necessarily having to even be represented by actual characters. In most stories, obviously, we're going to have many, many, many more characters than just these three. So what's happening here, right? what is happening is that every single character within your story, even if you have hundreds of them, are related to these three primal forces within the story. They are representing in some way one of these forces within your story. Now, first I just want to talk about what if you have multiple protagonists? So this is an important question because from a foundational perspective of story structure, there is really only one protagonist, right? And that is what creates the structural through line. So if you have more than one protagonist, you necessarily have more than one structural through line. That happens in stories with multiple plot lines, which I've talked about in a previous video this year. Basically, you're telling multiple stories, right? So you have multiple different story forms with each of these three story characters / forces happening in each of those plot lines until they coincide at some point later in the story. It's important to recognize that because you need to have a very solid through line to your structure, very focused, right? So you may in some instances have, and I talked about this as well in the multiple plotline video, where you have two characters who are operating within the same plotline together. And they both seem to share equal weight. Romances are very obvious examples where the weight is shared equally by two different characters and different points of view. And what's happening in these stories is the two characters are sharing the role of protagonist, but they're doing so within a single shared structural through line, right? They're not pulling in opposite directions. Even if they have, smaller goals that are separate, they're working toward the same structural goal or desire of being together and making the relationship work, right? The same would be true, like say, if you had a mystery where you featured two detective characters equally, right? They're working toward the same goal. So they share this protagonistic force throughout the story, and you want to make sure that that is represented in a unified way at each of your structural beats. Another way that, and the most common way that, and you'll people your cast with many, many, many people, but they'll still represent these three catalytic forces within your story, is that really each one is acting as a proxy for your main protagonist or your main antagonist or your main relationship character, right? I have a post about antagonistic proxies, which I'll link to. But basically the idea is, right, you have a unified antagonistic force in this instance, but it may not be represented by just one character. So you may have a big bad, and then he may have, minions who are under him and are doing his bidding. And it's not that these minions are separate antagonists within the story. They are proxies for the main antagonist and therefore acting in his stead. So it's still this unified force within the story. Again, that's harder to do with protagonists. You got to be really careful because the protagonist really is your through line and your structural anchor throughout the story. And relationship characters, you may have many different relationship characters. Obviously, you're always going to get the tightest effect in a story when you narrow these things down as much as possible and you don't have a lot of extraneous characters. But, in a story, for instance, you may have a character whose context and reason and why for what they're doing, and therefore representative of that relationship aspect, could be a whole town. Like maybe they are, it's more of a pastiche kind of thing where you're just showing the broader setting. And maybe there isn't a specific relationship character within the story. Very often there will be. What's coming to my mind right now is the Andy Griffith Show, where, Andy's kind of involved with this entire town, right? He's in relationship with many, many different people throughout the town, but there are primary relationships. There's his son, Opie, there's his deputy and best friend, Barney, and his Aunt Bee, things like that. But all of the characters within the entire show relate to him and interact with him as either an antagonistic force or a relationship character. So in very simplified terms, you could think of the relationship character as the one the protagonist is doing things for, and the antagonist force and the characters related to that as being the one they're doing it against, right? They're trying to move through that versus doing it for somebody else. So I hope that's helpful. Sometimes oversimplifying things can be the opposite of helpful. So if it doesn't resonate, if it feels confusing, then just forget about it. But the essence of what I'm trying to communicate here is that there are three engines kind of within your story. And if you're ever confused about whether or not a character is useful or is extraneous, or you have too many characters or not enough characters, this is kind of a good place to come back to, and then you can examine your cast and kind of go through and say, okay, this character's, a protagonist. These characters are representing the antagonistic force. These characters are representing the relationship aspect within the story. And that reflection back to the character of, the growth qualities that are necessary. And you can examine, would my story be stronger if I, got rid of some of these and just focused in on, one specific character to represent each of these? Would it create a stronger dynamic for my protagonist? Or do I need more? Do I need to work with more? And how do I do that in a cohesive way that is still structurally pertinent? Thinking about, kind of putting each character in the little box where they belong can be helpful in organizing them and seeing, where maybe some things are misplaced and they're not fulfilling their optimum job within the story, and or they're completely extraneous. So I hope that's helpful. If you have questions for future videos, you can leave those down below in the comments and I will consider them. And if you'd like to stay in touch with me and the posts that I put out on my blog and podcast every Monday, you can do that by signing up on my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You can also hook up with me at Instagram at author KM Weiland. I will see you in the next video. And until then, happy writing.